everybody. Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Okay. My name is Roselle Abraham, and I'm an assistant professor. I'm a physician scientist in Department of Medicine. I'm a cardiologist. I see patients and also a researcher. So today I'll present some introduction to stem cells. So you can have an idea of not only some basic aspects of stem cells, but also what is the clinical applications I'd like to divide my talk into 3 parts. One is introduction to cardiac physiology, which you guys know very well. Just to provide a perspective as to why stem cell therapy is important, and the types of stem cells, as well as the clinical trials of stem cells in the heart, and a little bit about the cellular research that I do. With respect to stem cells, I work both in adult stem cells as well as in embryonic stem cells, and we are using stem cells both for cardiac regeneration as well as in vitro models to model human disease. So the disease I work on is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's the most common cause of 7 million people now, and it's the most common cardiac genetic disease. And so we are making in vitro models using reprogrammed cells to then investigate pathophysiology, come up with sort of personalized medicine and options for our patients and families. But today I'm going to restrict my talk to just cardiac regeneration. So as you are all aware of, heart attacks are a big problem, and when you have damage to heart tissue, you have reduction in ejection fraction. So in clinical medicine, we use various imaging modalities to understand what is going on with heart function, as well as to get some understanding of the mechanisms of the reduction in heart function. So the most common modality that is used is echocardiography. And this is an example of an echocardiogram where you can see the RV and LV, and then you can see the atria at the bottom. So, and the other modality that's used not very often, but is more common at Hopkins, is cardiac MRI. And the advantage of cardiac MRI is that you have very good spatial resolution, and you can also identify areas of infarct by giving a contrast agent called gadolinium. So the problem with heart attacks is that once you've already damaged your heart muscle and you have a scar, then you set up the stage for arrhythmias. And as you guys well know, reentient arrhythmias are the most common cause of cardiac arrest after a heart attack. And these are simulations by Flavio Fenton's group, where you can see this is a reentry. This would present as ventricular tachycardia, which can result in a cardiac arrest or a syncope or passing out in patients. And this is a simulation, a 2D simulation of ventricular fibrillation. And so these are the arrhythmias that often happen in patients after heart attacks, as well as in patients with other cardiomyopathies like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and arrhythmogenic right ventricular dysplasia. So the problem with a heart attack is that it is caused, as you guys know, by a blockage, like a thrombus, in one of the coronary arteries, resulting in necrosis of the cardiac myocytes, and as a result, you have death of heart muscle cells, and the heart, the intrinsic regenerative capacity of the heart is very limited. So you end up with a scar, as in this case. And in addition to just having a scar, you have a lot of electrophysiologic remodeling that sets up the substrate for arrhythmias. You also have remodeling of the ventricle, resulting in heart failure. And so very often patients who have large heart attacks and don't get to the cath lab on time often end up with congestive heart failure. So what is heart failure? It's a clinical syndrome resulting from inability of the heart to pump enough blood to meet the demands of the body. And it results that patients often present with shortness of breath, they can't really do much, they have fatigue, and they have fluid retention and swelling in their legs, and sometimes even in their abdomens. So this is an example, this is an echocardiogram of a normal patient. As you can see, this is a short axis. You can see all the walls are moving really well. And this is an example of a patient with cardiomyopathy, and you can see the heart is barely contracted. And you can see this swirling material in there. That's actually blood because it's not ejecting well enough that you get this sort of what we call smirk. So that suggests really poor function, and that predisposes patients also to strokes from blood clots that go to the brain. So what are the heart failure treatment options? The best option is to prevent a heart attack, but once it has happened or once patients have other causes of heart failure, the options available are medications, but very often patients just don't respond to medications. The other options are ventricular assist devices, which are attached to the heart to help the heart pump, or they bypass the heart almost. Resynchronization therapy, I think Dr. Halpern may have talked to you guys about it, where you have sort of dysynchronous contraction of the left ventricle, and when you add a pacemaker that paces both the right ventricle and the left ventricle, you have more synchronous contraction and more efficient pumping of blood. Heart transplant, of course, is the best option in patients who have severe heart failure, but a lot of patients don't qualify either because of age or other comorbidities. So stem cells, for the last 10 years or so, stem cells now have the promise of organ repair on demand. But what progress have you made with stem cells? Stem cells for bone marrow transplant have been around for a very long time, but stem cells for repairing heart muscles have been around for approximately 10 years. So just to talk a little bit about what is the difference between the heart and the other organs like the skin and the intestine. So the problem with the heart is that most of the cardiac so most of the cardiac myocytes are arrested, so they don't divide. So cardiac myocytes divide during fetal life or in embryonic stage, but then most of them at birth are in the G0 resting phase. So just to talk about the cell cycle, typically in proliferating cells like stem cells, you have the G1 phase where the cell prepares for DNA DNA duplication, and so you have RNA and protein synthesis. Then it goes to the S phase, where there's actually the replication of DNA. The next phase is the G2 phase, where the cell prepares to divide by RNA and protein synthesis, and mitosis is where there is segregation of chromosomes into two daughter cells and then separate, and then the cell cycle begins again. So stem cells, they have the capability for replicating, but cardiac myocytes, they are arrested in this phase, in G0 phase. As a result, when you have damage to the heart, very few cardiac myocytes can divide and replace the dead cardiac myocytes. So what you end up with is a big scar. And so that is the big problem. So unlike the skin or the liver, where when you have some damage to the cells, the remainder of the cells, there's some tissue stem cells, the remainder of the cells can't have the capability to keep dividing. But unfortunately, the heart doesn't, and that is why we end up with large heart attacks and large amounts of scar. And once you have scar, you can imagine, it's really difficult. Even if you put stem cells in a scar, you're not going to be able to have the same architecture. So in the heart architecture, you guys must have learned that architecture is really important. Not only do you have this very particular orientation of myocytes, but you also have a lot of gap junction coupling, which allows the rapid propagation of impulse and synchronous contraction. And so architecture is very important. And so if you just have haphazard regeneration of cardiac myocytes, that's not going to be helpful. You can actually have arrhythmias, and that's what I'm going to show you. So the cardiac myocytes divide in the fetal stage of development, and postnatally, you have DNA synthesis and mitosis, but you have no cytokinesis. So if any of you have worked in any research labs where they isolate cardiac myocytes, you will see that many of the adult cardiac myocytes which look like this are binucleate. That's because you usually have nuclear mitosis without cytokinesis, and so you can have multinucleate cells. And so it is known that after injury, you can have increased DNA synthesis, but the number of myocytes involved, the number of myocytes that can actually divide and is very low. And so there are cardiac progenitors, at least there are cardiac progenitors, but what is the definition of a stem cell? So how is a stem cell different from any other cell that has the capability to divide? So the stem cell is not only able to produce mature specialized body cells, but it can also replicate itself. So the stem cell can divide and form other undifferentiated cells, and it can also differentiate down either one lineage or more than one lineage. So that is what distinguishes the stem cell from just any other proliferating cell. So what are the different kinds of stem cells? So we have adult stem cells, which can be taken from mature tissue, but they can only form limited tissues. So if you take bone marrow stem cells, they can usually form bone marrow components. The embryonic stem cells, though, are different because they are derived from embryos that can generate all three layers, so ectodome, endodome, and mesodome. But the problem is with embryonic stem cells derived from embryos is the ethical problems. They are immunogenic, they're tumorigenic because they have the capability to divide and they can form tumors. And now the most popular kind of stem cell is this induced pluripotent stem cell, which is essentially you take adult cells and you reprogram them to form pluripotent cells. So pluripotent cells, so these are multipotent. These are pluripotent. They can form pretty much anything. And so you can program cells like fibroblasts or blood cells to form pluripotent cells that can form any tissue. And so the advantage is that you can imagine you can take cells from a person and then make them into pluripotent cells and then differentiate them down to any cell type you like. So if you want to regenerate the brain or you want to replace some neurons, you could just take cells from the patient, make them pluripotent and then differentiate them down to cardiac myocytes or neural cells. And this is a very important technology because now we can make in vitro models of human disease. Until this technology came into being, we usually use mouse models to model diseases. But the problem is there's lots of differences between mice and humans. The most important from the electrophysiologic standpoint is the size of the heart. And so very often you can't get arrhythmias, or you can't reproduce arrhythmias that you see in patients in mice because their hearts are so small. In addition, there are a lot of differences in just the ion channel composition and the electrophysiology, the action potential between mice and human cardiac myocytes. And so even though the mouse is useful, there's very often therapies that work in mice don't really work in patients. And so now we have the opportunity to model diseases in human cardiac myocytes, and of course you can imagine you can then find novel therapies using high throughput methods, robotic technology. So the other nice application of these induced pluripotent stem cells is personalized medicine. So you have diseases like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy where you have patients and sometimes you don't even know what the mutation is. And then you have people who have children and they want to know, is my child going to get it, or how can we prevent the disease? And so I think this technology is really useful because then you can figure out what the actual mechanism of disease is in that particular family, and then you can develop targeted screening tests and prevent disease. So we are just at the beginning, and the way it works is that you can reprogram an adult cell by just changing by epigenetic influences. So the initial studies that were done, that is the initial paper, they use these transcription factors to reprogram the cells. And essentially what happens is that if you can change all the cells in the body have the same DNA. But how is it that a skin cell is different from a liver cell or a heart cell? The same DNA composition. The way the different cells are different is because different cells express different genes. And different genes are silenced in different cells. So there's differences in chromatin organization in different cells of the body, which gives you different phenotypes. And so it's possible to now use RNAs, microRNAs. There's various ways that you can induce and reprogram the cells so that then you can get pluripotent cells, or you can differentiate them down to the cell types that you're interested in modeling. technology, there's still a question of the efficiency is really low. You can have more than one mutation introduced. It's still very expensive, but with advances in technology, we should be able to scale it up, not only for regeneration, but also for modeling disease. So now coming to cardiac regeneration. So how do stem cells treat heart disease? Everybody has heard of all these clinical trials, and they inject stem cells intravenously into the myocardially. So what are the mechanisms whereby stem cells deal with hearts? So there are several ways. One is homing of stem cells at the sites of injury. So often if you inject stem cells intravenously, the cytokines or factors produced by injured organ that then attract the stem cells to that area. One important way would be differentiation of stem cells in the cardiac myocytes, because the problem with heart failure, as I showed you before, was that a lot of cardiac myocytes are not working well, or they're replaced by a scar. And so if you could have stem cells differentiating the cardiac myocytes early before you have a complete destruction of the artery, you could theoretically replace dead heart cardiac myocytes with the new cardiac myocytes. An important mechanism whereby stem cells, at least the clinical trials, the stem cells in clinical trials, improve heart function is paracrine factor secretion. So differentiation of stem cells in the cardiac myocytes is most possible with embryonic stem cells or pluripotent stem cells, but these are not in clinical trials for heart failure yet. The most commonly used stem cells are the adult stem cells, and very few of them actually differentiate in the cardiac myocytes. The mechanism whereby most of them improve heart function is secretion of growth factors and paracrine factors, and that can reduce death of cardiac myocytes and improve contractility, reduce inflammation, promote angiogenesis. So all of these are paracrine mechanisms. So the numbers of cells doesn't have to be huge, and just a small number of cells can secrete all these factors and then have beneficial effects. But the problem is the amount of functional improvement with these paracrine factors isn't very high because very few cells interact. So what is the perfect stem cell to treat heart disease? So the ideal stem cell, we don't have such an ideal stem cell yet, but it should be easily harvested using routine clinical methods, and the iPSCs would be interesting because we can just take blood cells and reprogram them and get large numbers of cells, theoretically. You need them grown in large numbers. Ideally, they should be available off the shelf for acute disease. Unlike the chronic cardiomyopathies, where patients can be stable for some time before they become unstable, patients who present with heart attacks and who have heart muscle damage, they don't really know they're going to have a heart attack, and so it's difficult to grow cells and keep them in case the person would get a heart attack. So ideally, if it's available off the shelf, then you could transplant the cells early before you have damage to the architecture and scar formation. Because right now, most of the cells, especially the autologous cells, they require at least a month for you to have enough numbers to transplant them, and by then, there's already scar. So ideally, there should be no ethical or moral quandaries. It should be safe. There should be no immune reaction or rejection. So if you use autologous cells, you shouldn't expect rejection. But if you use allogeneic cells, then you would expect rejection, or cells from other patients who are not majorly matched. Of course, the heart is an organ where you very rarely have tumors, and so you don't want to be injecting cells that are going to then produce tumors in the heart. And the most important way to regrow a healthy heart after cardiac injury, improve ejection fraction, and reduce the size of the infarct. And even if you have some improvement, if a patient starts having arrhythmias requiring defibrillator shocks, that's not going to help at all. So you have to go back and then ablate or burn the area that's causing the heart attack, that is causing the arrhythmias. And so ideally, you want your transplanted cells to be anti-arrhythmic and not pro-arrhythmic. So what are the different cell types that have been used for the last 10 years in clinical trials? The first stem cell type that was used was skeletal myoblasts, and they are skeletal muscle stem cells. Mesenchymal stem cells have gained a lot of popularity. It can be derived either from bone marrow, adipose tissue, or blood-derived stem cells are not in clinical trials, but they are also interesting, and cardiac stem cells. So the ones that have been, the first one with the myoblasts, these are this mesenchymal stem cells and cardiac stem cells are very, have been used quite a few clinical trials, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So to start with skeletal myoblasts. So skeletal myoblasts, and I like to explain, this is an example of how important it is to understand the electrophysiology of cells and basic cell biology before we go to patients. So skeletal myoblasts are skeletal muscle stem cells, and they were in clinical trials. So they did several groups did skeletal muscle or skeletal myoblast transplantation in rodent models, and then no problems, and then they moved on to clinical trials. So in clinical trials, what they did was they harvested the skeletal myoblasts from the vastus lateralis, which is the thigh muscle, and then they expanded them in culture. This is just an example of skeletal myoblasts growing in culture, expressing the GFP or green fluorescence protein. These are not the ones we use in clinical trials, just the cells that we do in the lab. But this is what the skeletal myoblasts look like, and what happens is when they differentiate, they form skeletal myotubes, and this is what skeletal myotubes look like. So the interesting thing is that when skeletal myoblasts, they have connections with gap junctions, but when they mature to form myotubes, they lose their gap junction. That's really important because if you think about it, your skeletal muscles are innervated by the motor end plate. You don't want your skeletal muscle fibers to be connected by gap junctions, because then if you try to move your finger, your entire arm would move. So unlike the heart that needs a lot of gap junction connections for efficient contraction, we want the opposite in skeletal muscles. So what happens is that initially these skeletal myoblasts have gap junctions, but they use them to mature. And once they mature, they lose them. And then you have these myotubes. So imagine, so now you're transplanting these myotubes that are electrically uncoupled into cardiac tissue, which is highly electrically coupled. So what happened was that after doing the studies in the rodent models, then they went on to people, and then they were surprised that approximately 40 to 50% of patients had ventricular arrhythmias in the clinical trials. And so people who did the clinical trials were surgeons, and they said, oh, this is probably just the natural history of cardiomyopathy. These people were going to have arrhythmias anyway, and it's just that it happened that these few patients whom we studied had the arrhythmias. And so then they started requiring defibrillators prior to transplantation in phase 2 trials. In experimental models, as I said before, they had some function and no VTVF. So what we did was we said, there's all these differences in electrophysiology. It's possible that the skeletal myoblasts themselves are causing arrhythmias, and it's not just the natural history of disease. So what we did was we made in vitro models of skeletal myoblast transplantation by mixing skeletal myoblasts with neonatal rat ventricular myocytes, and this is what a monolayer looks like. It's a two-dimensional growth of cells on a couplet. And these are the skeletal myoblasts that mature to form myotubes, labeled with green fluorescence protein. So we have an lentivirus that expresses GFP transducing the cells. And then we mix them up. We had this really nice influent monolayer. And then in collaboration with Dr. Tung from the Department of Biomedical Engineering, we did optical mapping, and we looked at what happens to propagation. So this is an example of a normal monolayer, just from neonatal rat ventricular myocytes, and this is the ones with skeletal myoblasts. So you can see how fast the propagation is here, and how slow it is, and it's very irregular. So what's going on is that you have slowing of conduction, and so at least this is the summary. So you can see the controls have a way higher conduction velocity than the co-cultures, because the co-cultures, when you introduce skeletal myotubes that don't have gap junctions, you have electrical barriers to propagation, of course you lose no conduction. And interestingly, the action potential, if you look up here, look at this action potential. It's narrow, and look at this, it's wide. So this is an example of paracrine effects of the skeletal myoblasts. So there, the skeletal myoblasts secrete substances that how we induce an hypertrophy or produce an electrophysiologic remodeling of the cardiac myocytes. So we found some action potential prolongation And action potential prolongation on its own should not be arrhythmogenic, because often when we try to terminate arrhythmia, we use drugs that can prolong action potential duration. But the main mechanism we think of arrhythmias is this marked reduction in conduction velocity. And I'll show you an example of how arrhythmias get initiated. This is an example of point pacing in a monolayer in a co-culture. And I'd like to draw your attention over here. You can see how here, you can see a wave break developing at 4 hertz. And at 3 hertz, there's no problem. At 4 hertz, you can see there's a wave break, and then you get re-entry. So this is an example of arrhythmia initiation in a two-dimensional culture. This would look like ventricular tachycardia in a patient. So what we did was we looked at is there a threshold or just any introduction of skeletal myoblasts producing arrhythmias. So we mixed different proportions of myoblasts with myocytes, and we found that 20% and greater, you had 100% arrhythmia incidence. So the more skeletal myoblasts you had, the more perturbation of conduction that you had. And these are all examples of, you had several reentries, and this one is a single reentry. So this would look like, possibly like polymorphic VT, and this would look like monomorphic VT in a patient. So we concluded that uncoupled molecules act as barriers to propagation. They alter the architecture, they reduce conduction velocity. And at high rates, you had wave breaks with arrhythmias. So after we published this, other groups also started looking at this question, and they started doing mapping in parts, and then it was concluded that indeed, when you use a big enough part, and you have enough skeletal myoblasts, that you do get arrhythmias. And so skeletal myoblasts are not used anymore for transplantation in patients. So this illustrates how you can take a clinical question, answer it with experiments, and then go back to so it's called a bedside to bench or bench to bedside research. So the next kind of stem cells are the bone marrow stem cells, and there's two kinds. One are the bone marrow cells that form the blood cells, and the others are the stromal cells, the mesenchymal stem cells. So mesenchymal stem cells can be derived either from bone marrow, or they can be derived from adipose tissue. And so these are an example of bone marrow cells where they have a particular markers on them, and the role normally is they are involved in cardiac muscle homeostasis, and they can promote angiogenesis. But very few of them or none of them actually differentiate into cardiac myocytes. And clinical trials, several clinical trials were done with them showing very little unknown proven function following transplantation. So the next kind of stem cell we use is the mesenchymal stem cells. So bone marrow derived cells are not very popular just because the results haven't been very promising. But mesenchymal stem cells are stromal cells in the bone marrow or the adipose tissue. And in addition to having parathyroid factor secretion, they also thought to be immunomodulatory. So they have specific markers, and they are isolated from bone marrow or from adipose tissue. You can expand them in culture, and then you can inject them back in the patient, or animal models intramyocardially or intravenously. And this is an example of these mesenchymal stem cells playing in tissue culture. So the interesting thing about the mesenchymal stem cells is that unlike the skeletal myoblasts, they actually have connexins. So you would thought that, well, if you have connexins, then you shouldn't be arrhythmogenic because now you have conduction, you have electrical propagation through these cells. But the problem is that cardiac myocytes have a particular complement of ion channels, and so they can generate action potentials. When you have cells that are unable to generate action potentials electrically coupled with cardiac myocytes, they would act as a sink. And so that was our hypothesis, and what we did was that we said, all right, let's do the same thing we did with skeletal myoblasts, and we mix the mesenchymal stem cells with the neonatal rat ventricular myocytes, And we found the same thing. But again, it was dose related. If you had only 5% of cells, there was no problem. If you had 20% or more, then you got a lot of arrhythmias in vitro. So the good thing is that in clinical trials or in experimental models, the numbers of cells that survive is really low. And so as a result, we haven't really seen arrhythmias by individual microinjection. If you had 20% of injected cells, if you had injected 10 million cells and 20% of them survived, possibly you couldn't have had arrhythmias. But unfortunately, most of the cells that are transplanted die, and so their functional benefit isn't great, but then you also don't get arrhythmias. So there have been several clinical trials done of MSCs, and again, they're all small numbers, as you can see. The first one was the STAT-HFG, and they concluded that the MSC was safe. But they did another study in 30 patients, another trial in 6 patients, and they said, oh, at least they're safe, and they may improve heart function. So of all the cell types, at least in the bone marrow, mesenchymal stem cells are the ones that are still in clinical trials, because there's no better cell, it's easy to obtain. And so now, in addition to mesenchymal stem cells in the bone marrow, there's also stem cells in adipose tissue that are in clinical trials. But the issue, again, is that very few of them really differentiated cardiac myocytes. They do express gap junctions, but they're not excitable, and if you have sufficient numbers, it may be fluoride. And there's some promising results in small clinical trials, but the benefit is really small. What we would like is an improvement in ejection fraction of pump function from 20% to 40%, and there's been no cell type that has been able to do that. So cord blood-derived stem cells, they are interesting. Again, they are a mixture of different cell types. In experimental studies, they haven't shown to show improvement in cardiac function. You need HLA matching, and there's not many studies on them just because of all these innovative issues. The last kind of stem cells are these cardiac stem cells that are also popular for clinical trials. And as I said before, until recently, it was thought that the heart was a totally differentiated organ and had no stem cells, but then several groups came out and they showed that the heart did have stem cells, and that you could isolate them from biopsies from the heart. So this is an example of a biopsy that is routinely performed in patients who undergo heart transplant, where we go with a catheter into the right ventricle and then take a small piece of tissue with a biopsome. And then you can isolate cells from these biopsies. So the advantage of these cells is they're autologous, they're cardiogenic, again differentiated into cardiac myocytes, plasmacytoid endothelial cells. But the efficiency of differentiation is really low, and there's a lot of questions about how good the data actually is. But what is accepted is that paracrine factors play a major role in functional improvement. So there have been several clinical trials, one of them is CPO, where they used a particular kind of positive cells, and they said there was an improvement in function. 16 patients, 7 controls. Caduceus, they used 17 patients with cells and 8 controls who got just vehicle, no cells. And now there's phase 2 trials, All-Star and Dynamic, where they are looking at these cardiosphere-derived cells, the stem cells, cardiac stem cells, and for cardiac regeneration. So to summarize, for cardiac stem cells, they are promising candidates, but the disadvantage is it takes 1 month to grow enough cells, and the functional improvement is really small. So to summarize, stem cell therapy is exciting, but we still don't have the ideal stem cell. The paracrine factors, called paracrine effects, is the main mechanism. Problem is we have very low levels of engraftment, or the numbers of cells that actually survive following transplantation, and we have very low levels of differentiation into functional cardiac myocytes or endothelial cells. So the pluripotent stem cells have an advantage because they are capable of cardiac differentiation, and they can directly contribute to improvement of cardiac function. And if you use autologous cells, you can immunosuppression. So there was a study done by a group in Seattle where they took a human embryonic stem cell cardiac myocytes differentiated from human embryonic stem cells, and they injected them into non-human primates. They found, so this is the example of these cells expressing GL3 that engrafted, but not surprisingly, they have a lot of arrhythmias in the transplanted animals, because when you transplant cardiac myocytes that are immature, they have automaticity, and the way the heart works is that your sinus node has the highest automaticity, which suppresses the pacemaker's below. So now, if you inject cells which are immature that have a faster automaticity than the sinus node, then you can then have an arrhythmia. So essentially the conclusion is that you have to not only get lots of cardiac myocytes from these cells, but you also need to mature them so that they're not electrically active in terms of generating automaticity and producing arrhythmias. So arrhythmia is probably due to the immaturity, and we also need robust purification methods to exclude pluripotent stem cells, because otherwise you can get teratomas. And teratomas are tumors that have pretty much all germ layers, and you can see tooth, you can see intestine, you can see liver, you can see all kinds of cells in these teratomas. And so purification is really important before you transplant cells. So the opportunities that they're still very useful, because you can do human models of disease. You can imagine that you can do drug screening with these cells, and then you can discover new therapies for that disease. So there's several unanswered questions for regeneration. One is what's the best cell type? What's the best timing? As I said before, it's best if you could inject the cells very early before you had heart muscle damage, and then you could before you had an infarct or a scar, so that you could replace cells before the architecture is changed. Is cell transplantation safe? And then the ideal thing to optimize the increased cell benefit would be if you could follow cells in vivo. You'd like to look at their acute survival, homing, migration, and engraftment. So that gets me to the next topic, which is in vivo cell tracking. And we don't do this in patients, but it's something that you can do in experimental models. And you need a mechanism or an imaging modality that is non-toxic, high sensitivity, high spatial resolution, and you can allow longitudinal follow-up. So my lab has we have pushed for this imaging in small animal models, and the whole goal is to then translate it into patients after taking it to large animal models. And there's various ways of doing it. You can either use a lentivirus to express a protein that then allows you to image the cell, or you can directly label the cells with nanoparticles or radionuclides. And there's various modalities. You can use MRI, you can use SPECT, which are both nuclear techniques, and then you can use optical imaging or bioluminescence. And so the ideal thing is you want to look at the amount of cells that survive in the heart, amount of them at 1 hour following transplantation, at 7 days, and longer. So that's an interesting result that we had, was that when we injected cells into the heart, so we opened the chest and we injected the cells directly into the heart muscle, and we labeled the cells with FDG, which is a radionuclide. And we were surprised to see that when we injected cells into the heart where you would expect them to stay, majority of them actually went into the lungs. So you had around 20% of cells in the heart, but a large number of cells went into the lungs, because the heart is a very compact structure. So when you inject something into the heart, it essentially goes by the coronary veins, and the cells are stuck in the lungs because the lung capillaries act as a filter. So imagine 20% of the cells, only 10 to 20% of cells are located in the heart even after direct transplantation. If you inject cells intravenously, less than 1% are stuck in the heart. Even if you inject them directly into the heart, you have only 20% at 1 hour. And if you look at 1 day, it's approximately half of them survive at 1 day. And if you look at 1 week, it's less than 5%. So you can imagine the huge amount of cell loss that happens. And so what you need to do is to compensate for this huge cell loss, people inject hundreds of millions of cells, just so that you can have 5% of cells surviving at 1 week for some benefit. If you want chiropractic effects, you need to have enough cells surviving. And so if you have such a huge cell loss just in the early phase, you can imagine how much cell expansion is needed and how long it takes to get that number of cells. So ideally, if you could inject fewer cells early, the autologous cells early, and you could have them proliferate in the heart, then you could theoretically improve the benefit of cell therapy. So we've been looking at not only the numbers of cells, but we've been also looking at the energetics of the cells. Because what we found is that most studies of cell transplantation, you grow cells as if they were in cells on a plate, and then you have to trypsinize them, dissociate them, suspend them, and inject them in suspension. So when you do that, their metabolism drops and a large number of them die. So we use this SPECT imaging of cells expressing this transport that's only present in the thyroid, not present in the heart, and so we could then figure out how many of the cells were in the heart by SPECT imaging. And then in collaboration with Jennifer Elisa from BME, we designed this hydrogel, which is made of derivatized hyaluronic acid. That's very bioadhesive, that sticks to the heart, to a beating heart, and provides adhesion motifs and rapidly normalizes metabolism and improves cell viability. So this is an example of if you were to inject suspended cells at 1 hour, you would see nothing. At 24 hours, when the cells are there, you can see a signal, even though 70% of the cells are dead. But if you encapsulate them in hydrogel and just apply them to every cardiac, you can see a really bright signal, suggesting that the cells are not only happy, and you put them in hydrogels, but they are also viable. So to summarize, acute retention is low. That means when you inject cells acutely into the heart, it's very low. Short-term engraftment is very low, and molecular imaging combined with tissue engineering is going to be needed to improve acute stem cell retention and engraftment, whether you use adult or embryonic stem cells or induced pluripotent stem cells. So to summarize, stem cells have the potential of helping all the patients, and we need collaboration between a multidisciplinary approach, collaboration between cell biology, tissue engineering, cardiology, radiology, to realize the potential of cell therapy. Thank you for the attention.
What if this is in the exam?
I don't know anything about it.
Oh, sorry, she not have questions.
This will not be in the exam.
Oh. I know this is in the exam.
You guys don't have to worry.
That shoots out your cell transplant so I can prepare on the actual heart cells person, but it's find issues with rejection of embryonic stem cells.
Yes, you need to do them in suppressing therapy. If you use embryonic stem cells, if you use induced pluripotent stem cells, theoretically, nobody needs them for animals, but theoretically,
you would just end up taking those from the patient by whatever.
No, so what you would do is you would take their blood cells, right, or their fibroblasts, or skin or heart fibroblasts, and you reprogram them into millions of heart cells, and then all right.
Lives?